Like so much of history, many take the right to vote as an inalienable right of American citizenship. The concept is simple. If we are a citizen, we get a say in our government. But 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. For over half of our citizens, the right to vote wasn't a right. It was a fierce and prolonged battle. In the history of Hall County, there was never a time when suffrage was not an issue. All the way back to the county's founding in 1861, a national movement was growing.
Well, in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, had the Women's Congress in New York State to start. I guess that was the first major meeting to start women's suffrage. So 1848 already. So there was a little hole in the dam and the water was starting to come out.
So the suffragette movement really started in Seneca Falls.
It really did.
And it was starting to really gain some traction, but then along came the Civil War. And that kind of put a pause in the movement.
And it was the suffragists who took the pause because they were told, which was probably true, that abolitionism was the most important statement to make at this time. And that if they stepped back now, then the abolitionists would step forward and would take over their cause. And that didn't turn out to be the case in every case, but they took them at their word and put their efforts into abolitionism at that time.
Those national discussions had resonance in Hall County, where suffragettes and supporters wasted little time organizing the first vote on suffrage. In fact, as with many things, Nebraska was a pioneer in the effort to win women the right to vote.
In Nebraska, we were actually one of the first states that really started looking at it and really supporting the ideas that women should have equal rights and the right to vote. The first time it went before the Nebraska legislature was in 1856 by Amelia Bloomer, and I have a quote here where she spoke up and said, "We claim all the rights guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States to the citizens of the Republic. We claim to be one half of the people of the United States, and we deny the right of the other half to disenfranchise us." And that was really actually pretty supported. It passed in the House and then it kind of stalled, just that statement to support women, basically because it was tied to some other issues and different things. But at that time we would have been the very first state, in really one of the very first places in America that really supported the women's right to vote.
Nebraska became kind of the center of this issue in America for a time in 1882, and some of the more notable people from the women's movement came to Nebraska in order to support the movement for suffrage. One in particular, Lucy Stone, she gave a speech in 1882 and had a great quote speaking to this time in history when she said, "When our feet touched Nebraska soil, we felt as though we should take off our shoes, for the place on which we stand was holy ground, not because of her grand prairies, but because her men are so noble and progressive that they have offered their wives and mothers and sisters equal rights with themselves."
The early Hall County suffragettes had some big name backup as they organized the first public vote in 1882. A vote that would be taken entirely by white men.
We talk about the suffrage movement in general during this period. We're really talking about a certain type of woman. We're really talking about middle to upper class white women. For even in 1920, when women, quote unquote, are granted the right to vote, we're really only talking about white women. This is a time when Native Americans aren't even really seen as people, because that took until 1924 for Native Americans to be given citizenship. You're talking at about a time during the Jim Crow South, and African Americans and African American women in particular aren't really given that footing to express themselves at the ballot box until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
1877, Susan B. Anthony came to Grand Island and she gave a speech at the Liederkranz.
And that speech was one that she gave in hundreds of places around the country, and even multiple places around Nebraska. And the speech was called, and it's a famous speech, it's called "Women Want Bread, Not the Ballot," which sounds contradictory. But really what she's saying, and that speech was actually based on an event that happened in Britain when the working class men were trying to get the vote in Britain. And they were saying that they wanted bread, not the ballot, in that they wanted to be able to influence what was happening to them, not let things happen to them.
But the momentum didn't just come from national names and efforts. In Hall County, one of the biggest names in women's suffrage is a name many in our area are very familiar with, Abbott.
Michelle has said it was so disappointing that we didn't win. I think everybody thought maybe this was the year, 1882. And when it was over, the committee met because there was a fair sum left over. They'd raised a lot of funds, and the committee met, and the committee then Edith Abbott's mother, Elizabeth, was the president of the local committee, and so they were calling the meeting, and the committee members were of a mind to, okay, what do we do next? Do we print more folders? Do we get another push going?
Fighting?
What do we do? Do we keep fighting for this? And I think in my own mind that probably Elizabeth had talked to Susan B. Anthony, and she said, no, this is the right cause, but it's the wrong time. She said, I propose that with our money, we start a public library. And, we have a wonderful library. It's actually the Edith B. Abbott Memorial Library. But when you think about it, when I thought about it, it's hard to imagine that then if you wanted to read a book, you had to own it. Or have somebody who would lend you their book. There was no place to get a book. And so they agreed, and they purchased libraries. Mrs. Abbott talked to a local lawyer, not her husband, and he agreed to keep them a dedicated shelf in his law library for books and keep track of them. And so the first public library was started with the remnants of the treasury from that push for the women's suffrage in 1882.
Despite the big names, the momentum and the passion of the suffrage movement, there were equally strong voices on the other side. One man in particular would be synonymous in Hall County for industriousness, leadership, and the anti-suffrage activism. That man was Fred Hetty.
There were really two factions against women in suffrage. There were the ones who said the women were the home caregivers that needed to be there to take care of their husbands and their children, or maybe their elderly parents or whatever. But the woman's place was in a home as a caregiver. The other faction was the temperance movement. And that's really what Hetty was opposed to. And a lot of the German Americans that joined the Sons of Liberty with Hetty, they were really opposed to women's suffrage because they equated suffrage with temperance. And thinking that once women were going to get the vote, they were going to be going after all these social justice issues like temperance, like education, like women deserve to be protected. A husband couldn't...
Actually protected.
Yeah, actually protected from their spouses in some cases.
However, we were a very strong German religious community too, and there was a lot of opposition to that. To the idea that women would go in the workforce and they would deal with politics and they would do that. They really were more for the home theory, to be at home and to work in the home, and that's how you support your country and that's how you support your family. And so Hall County really had quite a group of people that were able to banter back and forth. But if you read the newspaper accounts, they also had a lot of support.
It comes back to this idea of spheres of influence that was really popular during this time. The domestic sphere was considered the female space, and women were seen to take care of the home, to take care of the children, and that it was an arena that was separate and apart from the outside world, which is where men were seen to, to dominate the political arena, the business arena. And, it was definitely, both were important. Today it's easy to look back and say one was better and one was worse, and one represents a great deal of oppression and the other one represents a great deal of opportunity. There are institutions that didn't view it that way at the time. Institutions like the Catholic Church were very much against the suffrage movement. They were against, they feared that there would be spikes in divorce that came with greater female autonomy. They were afraid that women would be forced to abandon certain philanthropic efforts that they had previously had the time to pursue. And who would do that then? Who would pursue those causes? So,
Yes.
Some of the arguments against it were so shallow that you just shake your head. If you do realize, women, one headline that I read, that if you register to vote, you'll have to give your name, your address,
Your weight.
and your age. That's lousy.
Yeah, and one of the things too, which I thought was interesting in the 10 reasons why women didn't want the ballot, and again, this was published in newspapers across the state, including Grand Island.
I haven't read it
I
yet, so.
did, is, one of the things that they realized, or they said when women, why they didn't want the ballot, one of the things was, well, because they realize if they get the right to vote, they're going to have to serve on juries.
As the arguments raged, many men and even a number of women found themselves in agreement with Hetty and the Sons of Liberty. Nationwide, the suffragettes faced one of the hardest obstacles in American politics, changing the minds of more than 50% of their countrymen. Harder still was this majority believed women were too weak to engage in representative democracy. The ideas expressed in political cartoons and newspaper articles speak for themselves.
Because they have not lost faith in their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers, who afford full protection to the community, there being no call for women to relieve them of the task. Because women realize that when they become voters, they will in consequence have to serve as jurors and be compelled to hear all the repugnant details incident to murder trials and trials for other crime, disclosing unspeakable wickedness, jury service is abhorrent to every normal woman. Because in political activities there is a constant strife, turmoil, contention, and bitterness, producing conditions from which every normal woman usually shrinks. Because the primary object of government is to protect persons and property, this duty is imposed by nature upon man, and women being by nature absolved from assuming a task to them impossible. Because when women noisily contest and scramble for public office, woman pitted against woman, they write an indictment of womankind against which all right-minded women seriously protest. Because women can accomplish more through counseling than can attain through commanding. Because women's suffrage will not enhance peace and harmony in the home, but on the contrary, in the heat of a campaign, it is sure to bring about dissension and discord. Because Nebraska women are already enjoying a greater measure of protection and privilege under the law than do women of any state where women vote. Because the woman worker wants rest and quietude, not political excitement. Because every reason supporting the claim of women to vote, supporting also the right of women to be consulted as to whether they shall or shall not be given the ballot.
To add to the complexity of the suffragettes' task, many Germans in Hall County equated women voting with another very real and at the time very unpopular consequence.
So another factor that played a factor in the United States, but also in Grand Island, Hall County, was prohibition.
yes.
And the idea of temperance. So here we've got rights, we've got race. We haven't even talked about taxation and representation. And then we have prohibition and whether or not all these bills and rights that are being passed would be tied to some sort of prohibition or temperance, because it is very true that a lot of the suffrage organizations also had a rallying cry around no alcohol.
Yes.
But there were definitely some suffragists. Carrie Nation was one of them. You know, she, she would come in and smash up saloons
With her trusty hatchet.
with her trusty hatchet. And she was saying, you know, that men, again, were spending all the money. They weren't taking care of their wives and their children. They were spending the money gambling and on prostitution and on alcohol. And so, yeah, there were some of the suffragists that were very much for
who in
temperance.
their own minds had combined those two issues, or three issues, because it was gambling, liquor, and prostitution that were combined.
Despite many of these beliefs and their popularity, suffrage activists tried to put their issue in the Nebraska Constitution several times to no avail. And when that didn't work, suffrage was put on the Hall County ballot in 1882. The measure failed by a 3-1 margin. Then it failed again in 1887, and in 1889, and in 1891, and in 1897, and in 1909. Despite the continued losses at the ballot box, each time more voters were convinced by the suffragettes. But not enough, so it seemed, until 1914.
And then 1914 looked like it was going to be the year.
Yes, it did.
World
War One.
We
On its
finally
way.
got it as an amendment to the Constitution. We got it on the ballot again. Again, it was really heated, and the Germans were very much opposed to it, Hetty especially. It really looked like this was going to work. But the German community was really still very much against it, and it failed. But it didn't fail by much. 47% of the population that voted for suffrage. So we were almost there. And that was 1914. Then World War I came around. And the anti-German sentiment that came with it. So in 1917, there was another push. It's like, we're going to try for partial suffrage. We're going to try for what Kansas actually accomplished in the beginning for municipal suffrage rather than full suffrage. And Nebraska at that time still had a divided house, split house. There was the House and the Senate. 1917, the House voted that women should be given the right to vote in municipal elections. It went to the Senate, and it looked like it was going to die in the Senate. It was going to be DOA and never make it to the governor's desk. But what happened was, because there was this anti-German sentiment going on, there was this push going on to repeal a bill that would allow people in a community to decide if German language could be taught in their schools. And we have this anti-German sentiment going on right now, and the Senate did not want this bill to be repealed. So they kind of agreed, we'll throw in our hat with the suffragists, and we'll let this pass through the Senate. So it did, and it went to the governor's desk. And he signed it. So in 1917, Nebraska women finally got the right to vote in municipal elections and for presidential, but not for any state offices.
Municipal suffrage was something, but it was not what the suffragettes wanted. They were so close to full national suffrage. After years of being told only men should have the right to vote. While the effort had been national and local, when the day was finally won, the change was sweeping and broad, not local and focused.
We were the 14th state to ratify.
The 14th state to ratify, which was early on because you needed 3/4 of the states for it to be considered a law.
And yeah, for all those who maybe don't know how difficult it is to pass a constitutional amendment, it's incredibly difficult. It's probably the most difficult thing that a political body in this country can do, because even after it passes the Congress and after it passes the Senate and it is signed by the presidents, it then has to go to the 50 state houses, and then 3/4 of those state houses has to vote in agreement with that amendment. And in the case what it is now with 50 states, that requires 36 state houses to vote yes. And Tennessee was the 36th state to do so on August 26, 1920.
One of the potent arguments against anti-suffrage was that if women were given the right to vote, they simply would not do it. Did that come to pass in Hall County?
One of the arguments that was made in a newspaper was, even if you give women the right to vote, they're not going to do it. At Omaha at that time, women could vote for some local elections like school board. And so they were appointed to those elections, and they said the last election, women only represented 8% of the vote. So even if you give them the vote, they're not going to vote, was kind of the argument. So why bother? Why go through all this? But when women finally got the right to vote in 1920 during the presidential election in Omaha, the newspaper reported at noon that day, on election day, over half of the people that had cast a ballot were women.
The effects of winning the right to vote were felt far and wide throughout the country. In Hall County, the line can be drawn directly from the suffragettes to others who did wonderful things in our community and in the nation.
You know, we have a county board of supervisors that is, it has had lots of women representation. We have female superintendents of the school. I think we've made a lot of progress. You know, the legacy is that we can't quit. We have to keep being educated. We have to keep funding those organizations that allow education, because there are still those people that are disenfranchised in our community and in the nation. And it's our role and our obligation, I think, from our ancestors and our pioneer days, that we don't stop those causes.
We had the greatest number of women elected to the United States Congress in 1 year in 2018.
Yes.
In the 1980s, we had Kay Orr, who was the governor of Nebraska, first female governor of Nebraska, I believe. So I do think that that arc of history is bending towards justice when you look at milestones like that. And I don't see any reason why that won't continue into the future.
You know, another reason why that they thought women should not have the right to vote, or did not want the right to vote, was because, oh my gosh, if you had a woman running for office and she was running against another woman, they would disparage one another, and that's the very opposite of what women should be doing. They should not be tearing each other down, and we don't want to put women in these positions. Well, I'm here to tell you, no. My ancestress, Elizabeth Steuben, who was left alone with little children, and she did live to see finally, well, no, she didn't. She died in 1919, so she did not actually get the right to vote. So I, here as her great-great-great-granddaughter, I did run for public office here in Hall County with another woman, and neither one of us tore each other down.
The battle for the right to vote was over. But what of the legacy? The fight for equality still rages on today. Has the spirit of the suffragettes, who lost but kept fighting, who were defeated but persisted, remained with us?
Looking at current data on the number of women who vote and the number of men who vote in Hall County, women outpace men showing up at polling sites and getting by mail ballots. So if we look at in 2018, the general election in 2018, we had about 8,700 women and we had 7,800 men. So that's 54%, or 53% rather, 53% women showing up to cast their ballots in that election. In our last primary, which is kind of the pandemic primary, women again outpaced men in voting, 54%. We had 6,700 women and 5,600 men who cast ballots in that election. We're coming up on a presidential election here, so if we look at the statistics from the last presidential election in 2016, again, women outpaced men at the ballot box, 54%. We had 11,794 votes cast by women and just over 10,000 cast by men. So women definitely appreciate and utilize the power of the vote in Hall County. Also, I've noticed in looking at some of our international ballots that we have, there are some people who live in Grand Island and Hall County who are getting ballots. They're living in another country. They might be missionaries, they might be in the military. These people are die-hard voters. They're really dedicated about it. We had a couple of missionaries who were in the Amazon and they wanted to vote, and they filled out their federal postcard application, which is the international application to have it sent overseas, And in that case, we can send a ballot via email because a lot of times the postal delivery just isn't available. So these two missionaries, I had emailed the ballot to them in the Amazon, and they were trying to get it back, and a tree had fallen and took out their generator, and they were really upset about that. They had to go, and they responded to it by going on a hike to get a new generator to bring it back so that they could get their computer up and going again so they could email their ballot back. They were very passionate about getting that vote in. And on the flip side of that, some people just really don't want to vote at all and they don't participate. We've had, in just the last few weeks in preparation of this presidential election upcoming, a number of people who have come in to register for the very first time. I had a couple just 2 weeks ago register for the very first time. She was 72, he was 76. And they had never, not only not been registered, obviously, but they've never voted. So the question is, why now? The reason they were registering now is because their two daughters had said, you need to be participating in voting. And so the power of children sometimes, even into adulthood, can make a big difference.
It's important to vote to hold our civic leaders accountable to the will of the people.
To me, voting is the hallmark of citizenship, meaning it is not a one-time event, nor is it about one election. Vote in every election, local, state, and federal, because voting is a right, and to me it is the path for outlining what I need, our community needs, the state needs, and our nation needs in the future.
Having the right to vote means that I get to shape what happens in my community, across the state, and across the country. Voting allows all voices to be heard and to have a say in what the future holds.
I just completed my vote by mail application and sent that off yesterday. And I'm voting because I really care about issues. This year I feel like is unprecedented, but even since I turned 18, I remember registering to vote for the first time, and I remember voting in that election, and it was just, I don't know, this sense of responsibility and sort of duty, and a sense of honor, I guess, to cast a ballot. Not only for, I used to care a lot more about like national issues, but now as I'm older and I have kids, I'm really focusing on these local elections, right? And thinking about these issues that are going to impact my family, these issues that are going to impact my kids, and certainly on the national level, there's issues that will, impact my family as well. So I vote for the issues.
Because we still have the immigrant story, and we still have disenfranchised stories, and we still need to come together in a lot of ways, but to see that, the successes happen and we push forward and we're only getting closer and closer to that justice moment. I think that's our legacy, and again, like I said, I think that's our responsibility.